Here's what's coming up on the program. Nearly 2 million people are displaced by severe flooding in China's northern Shanxi province. Iraq claims to have captured the jihadist group Islamic State's financial chief in an operation outside its borders. Last trial begins for suspects in the murder of Africa's Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara. A warm welcome to the program, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced by floods in China's Shanxi province. Continuous downpours triggered severe floods in the area. The provincial emergency management department says more than 120,000 people have been temporarily evacuated so far. Some 2.9 million, it's roughly 190,000 hectares of crops were damaged, and more than 17,000 houses collapsed due to the heavy rains, according to the emergency department. And on Saturday, China National Commission for Disaster Reduction and the Ministry of Emergency Management jointly activated a level 4 emergency flood response in Shanxi. The province also issued a level 3 emergency response for natural disasters. China has a 4-tier flood control emergency response system, with level 1 being the most severe. In another development, China's Premier Li Keqiang says the country will go all out to develop green and low-carbon energy and ensure energy security. Premier Li, also a member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and head of the National Energy Committee, said energy has a great bearing on China's overall economic and social development. He noted that during the 13th five-year plan, that's from 2016 to 2020, under the strong leadership of the CPC Central Committee with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core, China achieved significant success in energy development. He noted that China is still developing the country. The energy demand will continue to grow with the advances of the industrialization and urbanization, and it is necessary to build a modern energy system on the premise of ensuring security and improving independent supply capacity. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un today called on officials in his government to focus on improving citizens' lives in the face of a grim economic situation. He made the remark at an event marking the 76th anniversary of the country's ruling party. State media showed Kim dressed in a room full of darkly dressed officials with no major social distancing, nor masks or other anti-COVID-19 measures apparent. North Korea's economy has been battered by years of sanctions over its nuclear and weapons programs, and heavy rains and floods have also taken a toll. But the North's leader says the country faces huge tasks for adjusting and developing the state economy and accomplishing the economic goals established in recent party and government meetings. In the meantime, Kim Kok-song, a former high-profile individual in leader Kim Jong-un's government, has been speaking to the BBC on the workings in North Korea. During an interview, he said he spent 30 years working his way to the top ranks of the country's powerful spy agency. The agencies, he says, were the eyes, ears and brains of the supreme leader. He claims he kept his secrets, sent assassins to kill their critics, and even built an illegal drugs lab to help raise revolutionary funds. He depicts a North Korean leadership desperate to make cash by any means possible, from drug deals to weapon sales in the Middle East and Africa. He told the BBC about the strategy behind decisions being made in Pyongyang, the regime's attacks on South Korea, and claims that the secretive country's spy and cyber networks can reach around the world. BBC says it cannot independently verify the claims, but have managed to verify his identity and, where possible, found corroborating evidence for his allegations. The Nobel Committee is still announcing winners of prizes, this time in economics. David Card, Joshua Angrist and Guido Mbens have all three won the 2021 Prize for Economics for pioneering natural experiments to show real-world economic impacts in areas from the U.S. fast food sector to migration from Castro-era Cuba. Unlike in medicine or other sciences, economists cannot conduct rigidly controlled clinical trials. Instead, natural experiments use real-life situations to study impacts on the world, an approach that has spread to other social sciences. Past Nobel Economics Prizes have been dominated by U.S. institutions, and this was no exception.
The thing that the Nobel Committee was thinking of was the idea of trying to learn about society and economic forces in society and the way people interact and so on from observing disruptive or unusual events and trying to infer from those events something about the way that that our models are informed. For instance, in the area of the minimum wage, there's been just an enormous amount of research in the last 25 years following the work that I did with Alan Kruger, and not just in the United States, but in other countries. And I think reevaluating that evidence and thinking about it carefully and evaluating the whole thing from a more scientific view, not from an ideological point of view, I think is helpful.
We're in the Middle East now. Iraq says it has captured the jihadist group Islamic State's financial chief in an operation outside its borders. Sami Jassim al-Jabouri was arrested in a complex external operation by the Iraqi National Intelligence Service. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi explained this on social media without specifying a location. He added that Mr. Jassim, also known as Haji Hamid, was a deputy leader of IS under late Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The FBI's Rewards for Justice website alleged that he was instrumental in managing finances for IS terrorist operations and had supervised the group's revenue-generating operations from illicit sales of oil, gas, antiques, and minerals after it seized large swathes of Iraq and Syria in 2014. Iraq's security media cell said the detainee was close to the new leader of IS, Amir Muhammad Saeed Abdurrahman, who replaced Baghdadi after he killed himself during a U.S. Special Forces raid on his hideout in Syria back in 2019. As Afghanistan itself teeters on the brink of economic collapse, some Kabul residents have said they're struggling to make ends meet. The departure of U.S.-led forces and many international donors robbed the country of grants to finance 75% of public spending. Many Afghans are now unemployed and selling their possessions to pay for even scarcer food. International officials are preparing to fly in cash for the needy while avoiding financing the Taliban government. According to people familiar with the confidential plans, the emergency funding aimed at averting a humanitarian crisis in the face of drought and political upheaval could see U.S. dollar bills flown into Kabul for distribution via banks in payments of less than $200 directly to the poor with the Taliban's blessing, but without their involvement. Speaking of those dollar bills, the U.S. has agreed to provide humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, according to the Taliban government. A statement from the ministers said that the first direct talks, held in Qatar since U.S. troops left Afghanistan in August. Aside from aid, both sides talked about containing extremist groups and the evacuation of U.S. citizens. U.S. officials described the discussions as candid and professional, but say that the Taliban would be judged by their actions. The U.S. insists the meeting does not amount to recognition of the Taliban. A statement issued by the Taliban on Sunday said U.S. representatives stated that they will give humanitarian assistance to Afghans and will provide facilities for other humanitarian organizations to deliver aid. adding that the Taliban would cooperate with charitable groups in delivering the humanitarian assistance to those deserving transparently and will facilitate the principled movement of foreign nationals. The U.S., however, is yet to formally confirm the Taliban's claims on the aid. Our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird, has been monitoring the situation. Maria, thanks for joining us. What has the U.S. government said, though, about the talks with the Taliban?
Thank you, Amarachi, for having me. The U.S. is beginning the talks because, as we know, when the U.S. left, prior to even the departure, they said that they would be focusing in on humanitarian issues. We all know, as you mentioned earlier in the show, that there is almost a lack of even having enough food and enough resources to be able to have ends meet. And so knowing that the U.S. Is beginning to have the talk with Taliban, we know that that was going to, at some point, have to begin and have to start. This is just the beginning. And as the U.S. has noted, the Deputy Director for the CIA is leading the talks, and there is some speculation that ISIS is beginning to invade in that region. And so that is obviously going to be at the height of the concern for the U.S.
Yeah, but now it is unavoidable that the U.S. government has to speak to the Taliban. But then how do you speak to a government you do not recognize, and yet you're making deals with them to be able to bring in all of these humanitarian aid into a country that you once lived in?
This is the conflict that the U.S. is going to have to figure its way through. We know that, as you mentioned, the U.S. does not recognize the Taliban as a true government. And how can they, if this is the group of individuals that they went in for 20 years to try to bring forth and to strengthen the former government? And so that becomes a conflict of itself. But I think it understands, and from a humanitarian perspective, understands that it needs to work with the Taliban in order to try to come in a way in which you don't create additional conflicts and you don't create additional warfare and insecurity and a lack of safety for those Afghans. And so that is really, I think, where the U.S. is focusing its negotiations on at this time, is really trying to keep some level of security and safety for the Afghan people.
But on the part of the Taliban, it seems like some sort of victory, doesn't it? In the end, you have the U.S. still very concerned about the situation in Afghanistan, even though, the Taliban promised, things will get back to normal. And they seem to be wanting to bring things back to normal, but that's far from it. So what are other U.S. allies saying about this? And are they also in talks with the Taliban to discuss ways of bringing in humanitarian aid? Because I do remember the EU did mention they will have to relate with the Taliban at some point.
Yes, you're mentioning the global community. That is where the pressure for the U.S. to not abandon Afghanistan has come from. I'm not saying and don't believe that the U.S. had any intention to be abandoning the situation, but the global community, obviously, were a bit disheartened. We're not exactly comfortable with the way in which the U.S. left Afghanistan. And so the global community is pressured to ensure the safety. And now that there has been, obviously, threats and potentially evidence from the CIA that ISIS could be coming back in that region, that then calls forth the U.S. and obviously the humanitarian concerns as well. And so, again, we can probably see in the coming days, we'll begin to see more of the global community beginning to support the U.S. and also the U.S. reaching out to its allies to support them as they continue to try to find relief and assistance, humanitarian assistance in the region. The question really, I think, is where we need to watch for is how much more communication will they be having with the Taliban beyond allowing them to peacefully and without conflicts enter the region for humanitarian aid issues, or will they begin to address some of those very core government functioning and the way in which the Afghan government operates as it did over 20 years ago? That, I think, is where we're going to need to be watching for in the coming days.
Well, this is a careful dance between the U.S., the international community, and the Taliban. Maria, thanks for bringing us up to speed on this. So all eyes, of course, still remain, need to still be open and ears on the ground. Thanks again.
Thank you.
We have more stories coming up on The World Today. You want to stay behind for this one? High-flying Germans competing in hot air balloon championships. The exhilarating feeling of being thousands of meters above the ground. Stay with us. Welcome back. It begins today. A trial of 14 men accused of killing former Burkina Faso President Thomas Sankara 34 years ago. Sankara was shot dead during a coup in October 1987, which saw his friend, Blaise Compaoré, come to power. Before his death, Sankara brought in radical socialist reforms and was a prominent campaigner for Pan-Africanist causes.
The trial comes more than 30 years since Sankara was gunned down in one of the most infamous killings in modern African history. The charismatic Marxist revolutionary was widely known as Africa's Che Guevara. He was killed in 1987 during a coup led by his former ally, Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré, the main defendant, was charged in absentia in April with complicity in the murder. He is living in exile in neighboring Côte d'Ivoire and has always denied any involvement in Sankara's death. Sankara's widow, Maria Sankara, told journalists, like everyone else in Burkina Faso, we are waiting for the truth to come out. So today is the day that begins, and we hope and wish that the truth will come out. Compaoré's former head of security, Hyacinth Kafando, is also being tried in his absence. 12 other defendants are due to appear in front of a military tribunal at the Ouagadougou Conference Center in Ouagadougou. They have pleaded not guilty. More than 100 journalists from across the world are packed into the conference center at the start of the hearing. Thomas Sankara seized power in a 1983 coup at the age of 33 with promises to tackle corruption and the dominance of former colonial powers. The former fighter pilot was one of the first African leaders to raise awareness about the growing AIDS epidemic. He publicly denounced the World Bank's structural adjustment programs and banned female circumcision and polygamy. Sankara won public support with his modest lifestyle, riding to work on a bicycle during his time as a minister and selling the government's fleet of Mercedes vehicles when he was president. But critics said his reforms curtailed freedoms and left ordinary people in the landlocked West African country a little better off. Compaoré had previously said that Sankara jeopardized foreign relations with former colonial power France and with neighbor Ivory Coast. Compaoré moved to Ivory Coast after he was himself overthrown in 2014. His lawyers said on Friday, October the 8th, that he would not attend the trial, and Ivory Coast has refused to extradite him.
Back here in Nigeria, 8 weeks of partial electricity in Nigeria's commercial capital city begins today, and that's because the Transmission Company of Nigeria is set to commence the planned replacement of its 132 kVA lines around the Ikeja West, southwest Nigeria. The reconducting exercise, which will see an average of 10-hour power outage, has generated reactions among residents in line of repairs. Our energy correspondent reports.
The figures may vary depending on which agency is supplying them. Whatever those numbers are, between the installed capacity for power generation onto the capacity the Transmission Company of Nigeria is able to wheel, then to the last mile supplier, which is the distribution company, the over 200 million population Nigeria do not have more than 5,000 megawatts of power to share. Steady and uninterrupted electricity supply in Nigeria for the most part remains a challenge yet to be completely solved by any government. Though there has been some progress made from one government to another, but we are in nowhere near what could be considered an average performance. As part of several reforms introduced, the willing buyer, willing seller appears to be yielding results that represent what an ideal power situation should look like. For instance, there are some residents in Nigeria who enjoy 24 hours uninterrupted electricity. the percentage of those who can't determine when they can have uninterrupted supply, however, outweighs those in the category of premium supply. All sorts of alternatives have been deployed by users, and those options do not come cheap, in addition to environmental consequences in some cases. In the preceding weeks, there has been some notices flying around regarding a planned outage in some parts of Lagos and will be affecting consumers under the Ikeja distribution company. That planned outage is real and is set to commence.
The areas that will be affected will be areas from Magodo Shangisha to Magodo Isheri to Oluwora Axis down to Unilag Estate. Omole Phase 1 and 2 will be affected. Otedola Estate will be affected. Ifako Jaye and a part of Okera will be affected. The Alausa Axis, you're talking about part of Oregun, Salvation, Olushosun area, part of Allen Avenue will also be affected.
Whilst the information may have emanated from the distribution company, the planned outage is those of the Transmission Company of Nigeria that is planning to carry out a major work on the transmission lines and perhaps should have done the needful to keep customers abreast.
I feel there are better ways it should have been done. 8 hours, even an hour off light is boss, it no go easy.
TCN will take an outage between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. daily for them to be able to work. The reason for this is if you want to work on this kind of project, you can't work on live circuits that are potential. You have to de-energize them. They will be reconducting their 132 kVA line involving outright replacement of the conductors that is serving the Ikeja axis. The 132 kVA lines are those high steel frames that carry power from the generation plants. 14 of those will be affected for the stage of this work. Both residential buildings and businesses will be affected during this exercise, which will entail increased spend on petrol and diesel.
We are in Magodo Estate, one of the few estates in Lagos that enjoy premium 24 hours power supply. Yes, you heard me right, 24 hours power supply. It's premium because they pay for it. And that's a conversation for another day in terms of appropriate pricing and tariff for electricity. But in the next 2 months, that light will be interrupted at least 8 hours every day. And I spoke to some of them, and here is what they had to say.
I don't know how we can survive it. I have to go back to buy my generator because I've given it out already.
My video editing production has to go on, so I have to do my work. So I'll just be in an hotel for that period of time, and I'm doing my stuff.
Weekends, yeah. I'm running to my mom's or my sisters or anybody that's not living within this premises.
You're selfish.
Oh, please. I have to guard my heart jealously because we're really dependent on electricity supply. So, and we're really, really used to it.
For instance, SME owners say they spend an average of 3,000 naira daily to run their businesses. An additional 10 hours outage will mean spending more on fuel. They envisage spending an extra 2,000 naira. That would translate to 30,000 naira a week and 120,000 naira a month, so they will spend 240,000 in 2 months. For heavy users, usually referred to as MD customers, diesel sells between 280 naira to 300 naira per litre. For a 10-hour outage, an average of 200 litres will be required. So 200 litres translates to 348,000 naira weekly. In 1 month, you should budget 1.392 million naira. Multiply that by 2 months, which equals 2.784 million naira, a cost which may be passed on to customers who patronize the would-be affected businesses and services.
It's really going to affect us because I know now diesel is very costly now for us to be burning diesel from that morning time till evening. It's really going to affect us.
In some instances, Nigerians and Nigerian businesses spend more. This is, however, looking like a must spend going by the planned network upgrade. Again, this is another insight into the pains of poor and epileptic power supply in Nigeria. Olu Phillips, Channels Television News.
Oh, we're up in the air as we end the program. German hot air balloonists in the skies over the town of Tegernsee for the country's championships 2021. The best 25 balloon pilots in Germany are competing in different tasks over 5 days. And as like in any other big sporting, it's all about the material, the skill of the pilots, and serious money can be involved in the sport. Now, this competition continues until Sunday. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.